Okay, so we are going to work on the watercolor techniques assignment. So you'll need a paintbrush and a cup of water, and you will need your watercolor pencils. So the first step and technique that we're going to work on, first things first is you want to draw this chart on your second sheet of watercolor paper. Now, in Schoology, you're probably seeing all of the numbered steps. You don't have to include those, but you do want to include the written titles of each one of these techniques. So I would try and draw these boxes as large as possible. That way you can get a lot of practice with the different techniques that you're going to put in these boxes. So the first one we're going to work with is wet pencil on dry paper. So this technique may seem a bit unorthodox, but you'll take your plain water and one of your watercolor pencils, in this case I have violet. I'm going to dip my pencil in the water. Now, as you're working with this technique and your watercolor pencils, don't store your pencils in the water, because if you keep these in the water, the pencil will break down and disintegrate, and then the color will eventually kind of break apart inside the pencil. So it is okay to dip it in the water like this. And with this technique, you're going to see how the color goes on really bright and smooth. You know, if we use these watercolor pencils just dry, like this green, it is going to show the texture of the paper a lot more, and it's not going to be quite as vivid. Now, you may have to dip your pencil in the water a few times, so eventually it'll dry out. So you can see now that my violet pencil is no longer has any water on it, so the color's gotten a lot lighter and it's not covering the paper as well as it could. So with this technique, you can use any color that you would like, experiment with different types of marks and mark making. So I have my red pencil, and you may be able to see there's a kind of a little droplet of water here. So I can kind of work with that also. So I can use that droplet of water to my advantage and create more marks using that. Some colors like yellow, normally are pretty light. When you use this technique with yellow, the yellow gets super bright and vivid. So it really does look like paint. If I'm using this colored pencil by itself without any water, the yellow is going to be pretty light. It's going to blend into the paper pretty clearly. Now, one color that we did not use for the previous project when we were working with the color wheel chart on the introductory color assignment was white. So white colored pencil obviously is not going to show up on this paper real great, but you can take a wet white pencil and you can tint your color. So remember, tinting means that you are lightening a color and tinting it down so it's not nearly as bright. So I can take this white and go over some of these violet areas, and it'll take that dark violet color and lighten it up quite a bit. So it may take a little bit of mixing, but it will get there. And we're kind of mixing in the green that I put down also. Now, one thing to note with the white pencil is that you're probably going to be left with a little bit of the color that you had mixed with. So what you can do to clean your pencil, you can take a paper towel and just kind of wipe it off. That'll get most of the paint off. If you let it dry, just take your pencil sharpener and sharpen it, and it'll take all the excess color away. So you can also experiment with kind of mixing colors. So I can take this magenta and put it on top of my yellow. So you're seeing a little bit of the yellow underneath the magenta, but the magenta is pretty strong and dominant, so it layers it pretty well. And for all these boxes that you're going to work with, really fill the space. So really use this opportunity to experiment. I'm more concerned with your proper use of these techniques rather than what you're putting in the boxes. So you can experiment with the different types of mark making, blend your colors, really see how the colored pencils react with one another, especially when you're starting to layer these one on top of the other. You'll work with your primary, secondary colors, your complementary colors. So I've got my orange, I can set this next to the blue. And that orange will really get bright and it'll really dominate that area because of the intensity of the orange color, especially next to the blue. Now, remember, whenever you mix two complementary colors like orange and blue together, so if I take my orange and go over the blue areas, what's going to happen, it's going to create kind of a muddled, almost like brownish color. So whenever you're mixing your complementary colors together, they neutralize each other. So they start to create a neutral color. So I've still got a little bit of space left so I can continue making more marks. When your pencil's really sharp, it's a little more difficult for it to pick up color, so you may just have to dip it in the water a little more thoroughly. And once area is dry, you can go back over it with a wet pencil. So this violet's pretty dry, so I can go on top of it with this green. And so when you use this technique, you're going to get really bright, intense colors. They're going to be pretty smooth, but you're not going to see any brush marks. So it is different than when you're using a brush, like what you may be used to with your watercolor paint. Take a little bit of blue and kind of blend it into this violet tint that I made. Just try and fill a few more of these spaces. So you can almost kind of see these as little works of art or spaces for works of art. Now, when you dip your pencils into the paint, they do get paint splatters. So you have to be real careful so you can control some areas. If you get loose pieces of or droplets of paint on your paper, if you have a paper towel, you probably be able to soak that up pretty fast. The next technique we're going to use is crayon resist. So if you are at home, any crayon or crayons will work for this. So I've got a variety of colors. I also have a variety of brands. So we have this Crazy Art brand, typical Crayola brand. There's the Schoolio brand, and then like a pretty cheap brand of crayon that looks like it was probably from a restaurant or something. So crayons have different intensities in terms of the pigment and color. So this is, a pretty dark, bright color, this blue, but when we put it on the paper, it's really waxy, and less expensive crayons are going to have more wax than pigment. If we compare it to this other brand of blue, it's a little more dominant. If we take a look at two different types of violets, so here's your Crayola, and then this Crazy Art brand of crayon. Crayola is pretty bright, and this other brand, not nearly as so. So this is the same color, but the Crayola has way more pigment in it than the other brand. So it definitely stands out a lot more. So for this area of your practice sheet with the techniques, just make a variety of marks, but you're wanting to leave some of the white paper because we need that for the watercolor effect. And we'll drop in maybe a little bit of this red violet. So for this one, we're going to take plain water and our paintbrush. And then we are going to paint our colored pencil. So I'm just going to take my colored pencil, and you have to be careful of this too because it's real easy to splatter the color everywhere. So I'm just going to paint this. So what we're doing, we're just getting paint on our brush. So you can see a little bit of it there. And then we're going to paint over the crayon. So with the crayon being waxy, it rejects the water and the watercolor that we're applying. You get kind of this like really intense effect with the blue and the red. Get a little bit more of this red, put over the darker blue. And since the crayon is rejecting the watercolor and pigment soaks into the paper. Now, another technique you can use is take your colored pencil, dip it in water. This is already pretty wet. And then we can make some marks. So you comparing the wet colored pencil against the crayon, the crayon doesn't, really can't fill in all the little textured gaps of the paper, but the wet colored pencil can. Now I can also take my paintbrush, just get a little bit of plain water, and then paint over this area that I just applied with my wet colored pencil. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm just shifting this color around. So where it was really bright and intense here, I'm kind of just lifting it up and moving it other places. So we're getting a strong contrast between the red and green since these are complementary colors. And so right now we're seeing really two different textures. So the really bright, smooth textures of the wet colored pencil, and then the kind of rougher but bright textures of the crayon. And then of course the background has that light watercolor appearance to it. For the color gradient, using wet over dry, and what this means is that we're using wet paint or water on top of dry color, in this case, the colored pencils. So for this one, what I would like you guys to really start doing on all your projects is when thinking about shading, think about blues and violets and other dark colors rather than black. Because what black does, and we'll look at what black does on this, so I'm going to dip my black colored pencil in the water. It's going to really almost have like a marker-like effect. It's super dark. It's almost too contrasted against everything else, where this black just really jumps out. So when you are using other colors for like your shading and shadows, like your blues and violets, the effect is a little bit more harmonious, and there's more color or chroma to the area that you're working with. So what I'm going to do is I'm just using my dry colored pencil. I accidentally had a little bit of water on my violet colored pencil at first, so that's a little bit brighter, but that's okay. And then I'm going to go about halfway and then just kind of let up a little bit. And next you want a light color. So, what we would consider light colors, we've got orange and yellow. I wouldn't use yellow though, because again, yellow and violet are complements. So you mix these together, you get this kind of brown effect that we saw here. I'm going to use this sky blue, so it's light enough that it'll work. So I'm going to overlap some of this violet just a little bit. Carry these down, not quite to the end. And I'm going to bring in my white, and I'm going to make marks near the end of this. Now you can't see these marks at all because the white just blends into the white of the paper, but I'm gonna carry my white markings into the blue just a little bit. And once I blend all of this together, I'm gonna have this really nice gradient from dark all the way to a very, very light blue. So for this step, I'm just gonna get my brush to make sure all of my other paint colors are out of it. And just get clear water. I'm gonna start right here. And anytime you're working with a gradient, you may have to go back and forth. So I'm gonna paint this way and then go back a little bit, and paint this way and go back a little bit, and then paint to the end and work my way back. And so what this does, this helps ensure that all these scratchy colored pencil lines are blended in, so we won't see those anymore. And it'll ensure that all of my colors are blended together. So we don't want to see like a really dramatic jump from like violet to blue then to white. So we want it really smooth. We want that transition really subtle, almost to a point where it's really hard to see where one color changes into the next. So for this, I'm just painting up and down. Push these sideways just a little bit. Now I'm ready to start blending my violets into the blue. So I'm going forward and then backward. Now what I wouldn't want to do, I wouldn't want to stop here and then start over here, because then it's going to kind of get all your colors out of order in terms of lightness and darkness. See, I went this way and then I jump back and I carry purple into here, and that breaks the gradient. So you don't want to do that. I'm just going to use a paper towel and pull some of that up, and then it should allow me to carry these back over. So with this light blue, I'm starting to get some of the white that I put down. So it's going to make this area really light. So we're starting to see a nice transition. We have kind of a dark jump right here. So I just want to make sure that that gets blended in. So now I'm going to work my way back to the left. And I'm just going to go back to the right just to ensure everything is mixed okay. So now we're starting to see a nice smooth transition from the dark violet all the way to this very, very light blue on the right side. And this area of my paper has quite a bit of water on it, so this will probably take 10 minutes to dry or so. But you know, this is what we want to see, just a nice subtle shift from one color to the next. So for dry pencil on dry paint, this is where you're just going to use a pencil without any water or anything on it. And I'm going to make, again, quite a few marks. And then I will go over these with plain water to blend these areas. Maybe experiment with different concentrations of color. So I can press a little bit harder and get some darker greens. And we'll put in some yellow greens also. And so what we want to do with this, we want to get all of this color color kind of smooth after we get the water on it, and then we are going to go back over it with dry colored pencil. So I have plain water on my brush. I'm just going to go over these green areas. And I've got quite a bit of water, because I need to make sure all these little colored pencil marks are blended out, so you can kind of like agitate them a little bit. You know, if you work in a circular direction, that tends to work pretty well. So this really kind of dark puddle of color, I'm just going to leave that because that's going to look pretty cool once it's dry. Then I can go over it. So I've got these other green marks, blend these in. And some of these marks you can leave, so I can just lightly cover that with water and then let those kind of stand by themselves. And then we'll do the orange areas. So right next to orange, I have the yellow green. So we will have a little bit of a shift in color if we mix these. So if I go over this one area, you can see where the color has changed a little bit. And then where the orange overlaps the green, it kind of gets a little muddled. Not quite brown, but it's trying to get there. So what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to let this dry. And I'm going to move on to this one, and then we'll come back to this one. So that just needs to be completely dry. So for wet pencil on wet paper, for this, we're just going to take plain water. Make sure your brush is clean. Just put plain water all over this box. And if you start to notice your paper is kind of like starting to peel up a little bit, just try and use less water, or use a paper towel and try and soak up that extra water, because you don't want your entire paper to disintegrate. But for this one, you do need extra water on here, so you just have to kind of find that perfect balance. So for this one, I am going to take my colored pencil and I'm going to get the tip of it wet. So that way I'm getting pigment on my brush, and then I can just touch these areas to the paper. I can also paint over this area with the paint that's on my brush, and it's going to be really, really light in color. So if you're wanting really light values, this is a way to do that. You know, purple is pretty dark. I mean, we can see it right here. But if you have that wet paper, it's going to thin out your paint quite a bit. So we can paint this orange, add a little bit orange to it. And then another thing you can do is you can get kind of like a splatter paint type effect. So we can take this blue. I'm going to paint the tip of my pencil and then just kind of lightly like tap. And you get this like splatter paint effect. Now it will go all over the place, so you have to be real careful that it doesn't get on these other boxes. So what I'm doing, I'm holding my pencil like this, and then I'm pushing down on it, and it gets that splattery effect. So we'll use a darker color, and maybe a little bit easier to see. So take my violet and then just do the same thing. Get those dark splatters. So it creates this real like tie-dye type effect on your paper. Let's go back to this. This still feels a little wet, So we're going to jump over to the watercolor forms and then we'll come back to the dry pencil on dry paint. So for your watercolor forms, so you're going to draw a sphere. So I would just go ahead and draw these in pencil. Just regular pencil, then we can go over it in colored pencil. And so for these watercolor forms, you can use any number of the techniques that we did for these other 5 boxes. So you can use a different technique on each of the forms. You can use the same technique on each of the forms. It's really up to you. Now, because we are wanting these to look three-dimensional, this is where you're going to work with your dark and light values. Okay, so we have a sphere, and we're going to add a pyramid. So hopefully you remember how to do this from our form drawings. I'm just going to draw this triangle at an angle. So there's our pyramid, and then we're going to draw a cylinder. We'll just add a squished oval at the top to get the top of the cylinder. Let's see. So the dry pencil on dry paint, this is pretty dry now. It's a little bit of a wet area right here, but that's okay. So with this technique, what we're wanting to do is we're just going to set down normal colored pencil marks. So there's no water or anything on this pencil. And we want these textures of the colored pencil to really stand out. So you can work with contrasting colors. So here's a blue we can put on top of the orange. So not only is this a great way to create contrast, but it also helps create depth because you have areas that are really light and you have areas that are really saturated with color. So it goes from really saturated and dark to kind of light next to it. I could take, for example, maybe a black and just kind of like outline this. Kind of gives like a 3D type effect right there. And you can work with warm colors. So here we have the red on top of the orange. Just really experiment with like mark making on all of these. Now in areas where it is a little damp, so the paper's a little damp right here, you may find that your colored pencils are kind of light when you put the first mark down, but if you go back on top of it, it'll darken up quite a bit. So we're going to come back to this one now that we've added dry pencil marks on top of the dry paint. So remember for these, we want these to look three-dimensional. So I'm going to use my blue and add a dark side to my sphere. So I'm just using a dry pencil. And then we will add maybe a little bit of sky blue. And then we'll add white. Again, you can't really see the white too well, but once we add water, it will blend together. So I'm going to paint over this with plain water. So because these spaces may be a little smaller, you may want to use your smaller paint brushes. So we have this really dark blue on the left side, and it's gonna kind of shift into this lighter blue. I'm starting to get some of the white colored pencil mixed in with the other areas. So this would be an example of using a color gradient, but when this is dry, I can also go back over it with my dry pencil to add more textures. For the pyramid, we'll do some other colors. So we'll work with maybe a bit of violet. And then what we're going to do, we're going to go over this with plain water. And I use quite a bit of water, so when this is dry, it'll have kind of this like nice stain effect to it. And then I can maybe do something like add some texture. So I've got my crayon. Maybe just make some hatch lines, kind of following this bottom line of the pyramid. We'll just kind of make some very, very light marks with my colored pencil. And then we can go over this. And so the very little amount of colored pencil that I put down, it tinted this, so it's a kind of violet, but then those colored or the crayon marks are still there. For our cylinder, let's maybe do use the wet pencil technique. Make that really bright, intense green color. Push it this way a little bit. And we'll get maybe yellow green. So I dip this in water also. And we'll tint all this. We'll get some water on my white colored pencil and then go over these areas to create kind of a brighter highlight on the right side. All right, so this is dry, so I can go over it with my blue colored pencil. Let me create some like textured lines. It's maybe still a little bit wet because the lines aren't showing up too great. Sometimes it helps too if you sharpen your pencil. So I'm going to sharpen my blue colored pencil real quick. See if this helps bring some of these lines back. And if you want, you can practice working with shadows. So you can drop maybe a little bit of a violet shadow under this one. So our light is coming in this way, so your shadow would fall like that. And, so white is for tinting, black would be for shading. So rather than just making a dark black shadow, I'm just going to put a little bit of black underneath this sphere. And when I add my water to it, so when I add my plain water, it will take that black and mix it in with the violet. So it'll make it a really, really dark violet shadow. And we can do the same for the pyramid. So I can just take, so light source, this is pretty dark. We can say it's coming in this way. I can just make kind of a black line under this one part. And then maybe use green for this one. So another dark color. So this is just going to fall off the page a little bit. And when I add color to this, take that black and kind of blend it into the green. Essentially taking it from like kind of a regular green and turning it into like a dark kind of hunter type green or forest green. And for my cylinder, we can work with, maybe complementary colors. So I have my red, and for this one, I can dip my pencil in water. Just put a really bright red mark underneath it. And then we can touch it up with maybe violet. So here's my violet colored pencil, dip it in water just a little bit because this area is already pretty wet. And I'm just going to fade this violet into the red. So essentially what we've done, we've created a dark red-violet shadow. So we still have some white space in here. That's okay. So this is probably going to be the one box where you're not filling it up entirely like you have with these other 5. If you want to add color to them, you can, or designs. It's really up to you. So I can make marks in crayon or something if I want to. Just kind of fill up the space. More colored pencil marks. But you don't have to add any marks to this one. So these are watercolor techniques. If you have any questions on these, just shoot me an email. And when you are finished with this, make sure you photograph it and upload it to Schoology.